Assignment 4.3 Research Design. So research design, what is it? So it's sort of like a structure or a plan of a piece of research. So, you've got to think about what the outcome is going to be, what type of research is being conducted, and it's important because it helps us gain more reliable results. Because obviously, if the design is complementing what you want to find out, it's just all going to click together. In contrast, a research method is the small mechanisms within sort of the research, so how the data is collected, so the nitty-gritty stuff rather than what's collected or what's happening. It's sort of like, how has this happened, etc. So a different study is always going to require a different research design. It's all going to be dependent on what the researcher wants to find out and how they're going to conduct the research. So obviously they've got to decide which research design method they're going to use. They've got to consider what their topic for research is, what the intention of the researcher is, so what do they want to find out, what do they want to get out of it, and then the structure. And then once they've done that, they can then think about which design is most suitable, and then further on think about the method that they'd want to use. So there's different types of research design. So firstly is experimental. So variables are controlled and the independent variable is manipulated. Participants are randomly selected for this. So for example, a gymnast could perform a routine with an audience there and without an audience there. The audience is the variable that's being manipulated, so it tests whether the gymnast performed better with or without the audience. So they're controlling the other variables. So there's different types. There's independent groups, which is when different groups are used for each condition. So different groups are going to be used for an audience, different groups are going to be used without an audience. Repeated measures is where the same groups are used in the same condition. And then you could think about counterbalancing, so splitting the participants into Group A and Group B. So Group A will start in condition 1 and Group B will start in condition 2, then they will swap. This eliminates the practice effect. So obviously if someone's done it before, they're going to know what they're doing, so they're going to be better the second time round. And then the final one is matched pairs. So different people are used in each condition, but these people will always have similar characteristics. For example, they're going to be the same age, same gender, or play the same sport, etc., etc. So this is a really good way of collecting data because it's easily repeatable and it gives the researcher high levels of control because they can isolate certain variables and it sort of means that they can find out whatever they want to find out. However, there is always an inability to control all variables, but if this does happen, if the variables are all controlled, it can cause an artificial situation, meaning that it's less sort of, that real life effect is fake, basically. And there's always space for errors, including human and random errors. So correlational looks at a relationship between at least two variables which are not manipulated. Correlation can either be positive or negative, so a correlation coefficient describes this as well as the strength of the relationship between the variables. So a correlation coefficient describes whether it's positive or negative, or and also the strength of it. So the stronger the correlation, the steeper the graph is going to be, whether that's in a positive or negative direction. An example of correlational research design is just the relationship between age and flexibility of GB gymnasts and what sort of effect that has on the performance. So, the older you get, you could think about the older you get, the flexibility, the more the flexibility decreases, or, whatever. But obviously this is based around young gymnasts, so the age increase would only be small. So this sort of relates to real life because variables aren't manipulated, and plenty of data can be collected from this. However, it doesn't show the cause and effect of what's happening. It just shows what is happening. So it shows that this has an effect on that, but it doesn't say why or what's caused it. So a cross-sectional study looks at the population at a certain point in time, and it sort of identifies the relationships and links within this population. For example, comparing the flexibility of Great British gymnasts using various young ages, various abilities, including whether they want to be, professional or compete for fun, like as a recreational activity. So it sort of takes into account all these differences between the gymnasts. It's very quick and cheap to do, and data only has to be collected once, no repeats or anything like that is required. And it also sort of gathers information about participants from various age groups, various genders, abilities. Obviously, in this specific example, we're talking about just young female gymnasts, but within that there's lots of variance. However, the cause and effect, there's no sort of set in stone cause and effect. It's always sort of suggested by the data collected. So it doesn't give evidence that proves anything scientifically. So comparative is when two or more subjects with similar characteristics are compared to one another. So it can either be qualitative or quantitative. It can be either of those. So an example, you could think about comparing the relationship between diet and performance quality of different abilities of female gymnasts, whether they're national standard, regional standard, or even recreational standard. For this specific example, it can be educational. It could indicate the diet of a national athlete is obviously going to increase the performance quality, and therefore the lower sort of standard gymnasts might be like, actually I'm going to alter my diet so I can improve my gymnastic ability. However, it could be difficult to conduct, and obviously it's always difficult to control certain things, like especially with this example with the diet. You've as a researcher, you want all the participants to be completely honest about what they've eaten, blah, 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 etc., etc. Longitudinal is sort of like a lengthy observational study. It spreads over a very long period of time, which can be years, and it studies the change within a group or change within an individual over time. So it shows like genuine real-life changes, which is obviously a good thing. However, it can be very time-consuming, and if a participant drops out half a year into the study, then the study is going to be ruined. So for example, we could look at the effects of stress that might have on the gymnast over time, taking into account their lifestyle factors such as sleeping habits and diet, and education, stuff like that. And then finally, we've got case study, which is just a detailed investigation into a case about one individual or a team or a class. For example, we could look at a gymnast and their lifestyle factors and how it affects their gymnastics and their performance. So for example, diet, stress, sleep habits, education, you could even look at friendship, like relationships. This is obviously going to give us plenty of detail as you're solely focusing on one person or one group. However, it's obviously going to be time consuming, and it's going to give low reliability, and you're not going to be able to compare it to the wider population because it's obviously only specifically talking about one person. Also, it can again be, obviously, as I've just said, can't be spread to a wider population. This is just down to the fact that it's focusing on an individual rather than a group of people, so it's all different. So primary data is collected by yourself, so you've done your own research, meaning it's first-hand, so it's valuable. It can be expensive and time-consuming because you've got to do it all yourself, and also you could have participant bias if you've got to collect some data, so you just grab a few friends. They're obviously going to be a bit biased. For example, so you could collect data on the diets of the gymnasts at a local club or whatever. Secondary data is collected by another researcher, so it can be educational. There's disadvantages like reliability, credibility, where's it come from, where's it been collected from, and then there could be some sourcing issues. So if you don't reference or source this other data and where it's come from, there could be some serious issues. This is going to differ from the other example of primary data, because obviously the data you collect comes from another researcher, so they would have collected the data that regards to the diet. So classifications of data then. Discrete, which is sort of closed data, so yes or no isolated answers. For example, do you smoke? Yes or no. Are you male or female? Simple stuff like that. Continuous data is numerical data, and it includes decimal places. There's two types. There's interval, which can have negative values, for example temperature, or ratio, which has an absolute zero, so heart rate of a gymnastics performer during training, or speed or time or something like that, so it has an absolute zero. Nominal data is sort of being put into named categories and then tallying up to provide a frequency. So, for example, you could put gymnasts into categories as to how high or low their anxiety is prior to a performance. And then finally, ordinal data is just rank ordering things. For example, the quality of performance in a competition, or putting gymnasts into height order, just simple stuff like that. So now we're going to go on to talk about qualitative data. So it's based on data that can't be measured. It's descriptive, describes social happenings. It includes sort of like an empathetic understanding due to the thoughts and feelings that are going to provide depth. It's subjective, so it's all about opinions, which can be interpreted by researchers. It can be very unreliable, based on how they interpret it. And sometimes you're going to get way too much data. If an interviewee starts rambling on and on and on, you're going to get way too much and you don't need it. So we've got interviews, we've got different types. Structured, sort of like a solid guide that the interviewer is going to follow without improvisation. So stick to the questions, so you've got focus questions, exactly what the researcher wants to find out. It's also easy to compare to other interviews, so simple answers, it's easy to compare. However, these closed questions are an issue when you want to get information. An example of a closed question is going to be, do you complete at least 20 minutes of exercise per day? And this is because the answer is a simple yes or no, whereas opening up would be like, what sort of activity do you do? Why do you choose to do that? Also, the structure does make it very hard to get depth and emotion out of the interviewee, because you're not going into detail. Also, sometimes these interviews are going to be too formal and therefore make the interviewee maybe feel too much pressure or feel anxious. Semi-structured sort of has a vague guide but includes the opportunity for further conversation. So this type of interview gives the guide, like I stated, but there is a lot more flexibility for potential discussion. However, this is probably a good one. However, it can prove difficult to analyse areas. So obviously sometimes it's going to be easy to compare because of the closed questions, whereas when you go into more depth, it's going to be harder to compare. Also, obviously the interviewer is going to have to manage it, as they may not want to drift off and get depth in the wrong areas, if the interviewee is going to feel comfortable expanding on their answers. And then finally, unstructured. So obviously the advantages of this, because the questions lead into, it's more of a conversation than structured questions. So it's going to be a big discussion. So you're going to get loads of information, plenty of depth, because there's no regimented questions. So you're asking why, sort of follow-up questions. It's going to be, also, obviously there's disadvantages to everything, so it's going to be quite bad because it can be easy to go off topic. You know, if you get chatting, it's going to be easy to digress off here. Also, the interviewer could incorrectly interpret answers, and it can be very hard to analyse because obviously if there's so much depth and emotion, the emotion for each person is going to be different, so it's going to be hard to analyse what they mean and what each person is trying to say. Okay, so questionnaire is simply just sort of a set of questions. So advantages that the interviewer isn't involved, so the person answering the questions might feel more relaxed, so they can go back, reflect on their answers, take their time really. And also it's easily distributed, it can just be sent out via email. Thousands of copies could be sent out, so you don't have to, like an interview, you don't have to sit there and go through every question with every person. However, the researcher could read these questions and interpret the answers incorrectly, so they could read the answers given and think that it's meaning something else, which obviously has issues with reliability. The main issue with questionnaires is that people will be dishonest, as they're going to want to come across as sort of like an ideal person or want to give answers that they know the researchers are looking for. So this is called social desirability, where it's sort of where people are going to answer questions dishonestly to make themselves look better.